The INTJ, the INFJ, the ISFP and the ISTP. So these types have two main things in common. First and foremost, they are all introverted intuitive convergence, being introverted types with an NI preference. And secondly, they are constantly mistyping into one another. So we're going to split this video into three modules. The first module is going to be comparing and contrasting the INFJ with the INTJ, but since we already have a lot of content on the channel dedicated to each of these types, there's no need to spend too much time on that particular comparison. The second module is going to be comparing the NI dominant with the NI auxiliary, that is, for example, ISFP versus INTJ, and the third module is going to be comparing directly for the first time on the channel the ISFP with the ISTP. So let's jump into the video with a quick comparison between the INFJ and INTJ. So the INTJ and INFJ are NI dominants, having a preference for a strong and expansive introverted intuition with a convergent attitudinal preference. And for those of you new to the channel, convergence means the realm of responsibility and change, and divergence, its natural opposite, means the realm of order, an observational modality. As lens-dominant types, both of these types have a penchant for abstraction for its own sake, independent of any kind of concrete actualization. There is a highly holistic internal focus here, with vast amounts of internal information being intertwined in synergistic unison. So here's where they differ. The INFJ's introverted intuition and introverted thinking dominant pairing tends to approach this synergy in a much more organic or even atomic manner, whereas for the INTJ it's much more of a two-step process of introverted intuition and introverted feeling relating abstractly upon perceived extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking data. And as a result, the INTJ tends to have a more synthetic emphasis. As such, the INTJ is a more naturally empirical type of the two, and TE users as a whole tend to consume more information and have a much easier time tracing back that information to the source. And the INFJ, by contrast, is much more blind in this extroverted thinking realm, tending to infer more than they consume. Typically, this type breaks down source material on a much more atomic scale, coming up with entirely original theories as a result, whereas the INTJ's introverted feeling tends to be so respectful of the extroverted thinking source material as to be somewhat more resistant to any such atomization. However, while the INFJ may struggle more with extroverted thinking, particularly that of a more divergent and observational nature, the INTJ struggles similarly in the realm of extroverted feeling. And as such, whereas the INFJ may struggle to consume and store even extroverted thinking information, the INTJ struggles to consume and store extroverted feeling information. As such, whereas the INTJ consumes extroverted thinking and infers extroverted feeling from a more independent introverted feeling relational center, the INFJ consumes extroverted feeling and infers extroverted thinking from an introverted thinking theoretical center. Put into practice, the INTJ may infer how a person is probably feeling through the use of introverted feeling relational empathy, whereas the INFJ may assume how a mechanism probably works through the application of introverted thinking theory. So, in a nutshell, the INFJ has a holistic and highly organic introverted intuitive introverted thinking process inspired by extroverted sensing, extroverted feeling data, whereas the INTJ has a much more experiential, self-transformative introverted intuitive introverted feeling primary dialogue inspired by extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking data. SEFE information can be understood as social micronuance and mirror empathy, whereas extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking information is more concerned with the nuance of mechanism and aesthetic detail. The FE authority of the INFJ instills a highly conscious superego and social caution and general humanitarian drive, whereas the TE authority of the INTJ instills in the type a sense of competency, practicality, and logical caution. The thinking of the INFJ is convergent and the feeling divergent. As such, introverted thinking here tends to be highly organic and creative and even at times somewhat chaotic, whereas extroverted feeling tends to be an area much more cautiously observed and abided by. The feeling of the INTJ is convergent, whereas their thinking is divergent. This is night and day. The INTJ finds themselves in a constant process of limbic self-reflection and self-transformation, typically areas the INFJ may struggle more with. Conversely, the thinking of the INTJ is divergent, with extroverted thinking information being of a much more cautious nature, and mechanistic parameters generally more abided by than circumvented. The INFJ is in a constant state of theoretical reformulation, the loose and organic nature of which the INTJ may have difficulty replicating, as their thinking is directed more toward what can be seen and acted upon. Finally, both of these types share an extroverted sensing oppositional function. Being of a hyperdivergent attitude, both of these types tend to be extremely sensitive to the external tangible concrete, which on the plus side can lead to a greater sense of nuance and refined tastes. But on the downside, both of these types do tend to get overstimulated rather easily. While both of these types may flip into extroverted sensing dominant states, this tends to be done in much shorter and conservative bursts, and these types may get a little bit more drained than others. I think even for introverted types, these types tend to need their downtime. But don't go typing yourself as an NI dominant just on the basis of sensitivity to stimulation. Now let us compare the NI dominants with the NI auxiliary types, namely the ISFP and the ISTP. As extroverted sensing and introverted intuition here on the auxiliary axis, absent certain subtypes, there tends not to be a huge preference for one over the other. Rather, these two functions tend to exist in these two types in a greater state of natural equilibrium with each other. While introverted intuition in dominant position can ensue, in some cases, an unhealthy retreat from tangible, concrete, external reality, when extroverted sensing is in authority position, the greater tendency is to be inspired by it. And don't get me wrong, every single introverted type is going to have a natural tendency to retreat from external reality. But when extroverted sensing is the focal point of a type's authority function, it does have greater inspirational potential. As such, a sizable chunk of, even a majority of, ISFPs and ISTPs will tend to have a certain craving for and capacity for rich, external, tangible experience, which oftentimes serves as a fuel that will go on to inform their much more selective, introverted, intuitive visions. And in a good amount of cases, the extroverted sensing authority type is more likely to go out of their way in order to chase these rich, concrete experiences. However, this still does leave us with the more introverted and NI-centric variants of the ISXP type, who wouldn't necessarily relate to any of that. And these, of course, are the types more consistently mistyping as NI dominant. But in these rarer cases, the extroverted sensing authority function is still distinct, and there's still an extroverted sensing realization emphasis upon introverted intuitive design. Introverted intuition here is not pursued so much for its own sake, still being informed by the tangible external, and even in the most cripplingly reclusive and introverted ISP variant, there's still going to be an emphasis upon extroverted sensing as a kind of benchmark for NI vision. And even the most hardcore diver subtype of these particular cognitive types would still tend to spend much time fantasizing about realizing their NI vision in a highly intense extroverted sensing manner. Furthermore, introverted intuition here is far, far more autonomous from extroverted intuition than it is in the case of an NI dominant. And as such, this being considered alongside the highly possessive nature of this agency function, ISFPs and ISTPs tend to be extremely selective as to their introverted intuitive vision, and less naturally open-minded to alternatives once they've settled upon this vision. And this is a far cry from the more naturally expansive introverted intuition of the NI dominant. And this is all the more apparent when you consider the fact that the ISFP and ISTP are codec dominants, and therefore there is an exacting rational nature to this particular introverted intuition auxiliary function. And when we're talking about cognitive functions being rational or irrational, rational doesn't mean more logical. It just means it has a certain agenda. And with extroverted intuition here being more of a blind spot within these particular types, there tends to ensue a certain uncertainty as to the short-term consequences of one's actions. Whereas some ISXPs would tend to, as a result, exhibit more impulsive, SE-centric behavior, there would be others who, owing to the uncertainty of extroverted intuition blindness, would tend to avoid and abstain from any kind of risks that their introverted intuition cannot account for. As such, there is a big "it depends" here, but it's not unusual for these two types to oscillate between more impulsive and reckless behavior and overly cautious behavior. But what tends to happen is the cautiousness manifests more as a kind of resistance to the unknown, or resistance to that which they have not formed a strong, tangible, extroverted sensing attachment to. And again, this possessive nature of the introverted intuitive agency function is, complemented, albeit here in a more negative way, by the uncertainty as to extroverted intuitive potentialities. But this extroverted intuitive blindness tends to serve as both the type's natural strength and Achilles heel. The NI tunnel vision that coincides with a certain lack of open-mindedness to alternate potentials can actually give these types a certain single-minded relentlessness. So it's little wonder many more convergent variants of these two types would identify more with the force of nature descriptions of introverted intuitive dominance than that of their actual type. And just on the topic of subtypes, once a subtype is rendered convergent, they usually tend to switch their judging-perceiving dichotomy, which is why, as many of you will know, I'm not a massive fan of these MBTI dichotomies. Because again, it depends. It depends on your context, depends on your subtype, depends on a host of factors. And these MBTI dichotomies are just going to change throughout your life anyway, so don't get too attached to them. However, this very single-mindedness can set these types up for failure and subsequent demoralization should things not go their way. ISFPs tend to NI idealize relationships, for example, whereas ISTPs tend to NI idealize their own competence. And naturally there is a bit of a crossover between. So as far as mistypes go, it is the ISTP who mistypes as INTJ, and the ISFP who mistypes as INFJ. And this owes as much to bad type descriptions as it does the MBTI dichotomies. And again, there is a lot of crossover here. Because ISFPs have the same functions of INTJs, there can be a mistype there, just as there can be a mistype between the ISTP and INFJ. But those cases do tend to be rarer, because people are emphasizing the behavioral output and stereotype more than the actual cognition. Because technically the ISTP is the actual INTJ, the ISFP is the actual INFJ. Hear me out a minute. So you have, in the case of the ISFP, an introverted feeling dominant function. And you have this function informed by the auxiliary of introverted intuition to which it is assigned. So you have an introverted type who is an intuitive feeling type. And this dominant function is, in Jung's own words, a judging function. So you have an INFJ. You have a person who is introverted, whose dominant function is feeling, whose feeling is rendered intuitive by the lens to which it is assigned, and whose dominant function also happens to be rational rather than irrational, a codec rather than a lens. That is technically an INFJ. And vice versa for the ISTP, who is technically the INTJ. You have an introverted type with a thinking, judging function as their dominant, and an introverted intuitive lens informing this dominant function's agenda. So you have now an INTJ, an introverted type with a thinking function in the lead, informed by intuition more than it is by sensing. So it is an intuitive thinking function, and it happens to be a judging function. So it's INTJ. And you can see again why I'm not a massive fan of the dichotomies, because it all depends upon the approach that you're taking. You can make an argument for the ISTP here being the INTJ based upon the cognition and the theoretical principles, and you can make an argument for the INTJ being the INTJ based upon observed behavior and the MBTI dichotomies. I mean, convergent ISTPs especially, alongside their ESTJ cousins, I might add, tend to match INTJ type descriptions more than actual INTJs. I'd add that a lot of people who write about INTJs just don't really get INTJs. I'd even go out on a limb to suggest Elon Musk might be an ISTP. Not necessarily my CBT stamped opinion on the matter, but there's a good case to be made there, especially towards a more ambiverted ISTP, owing to the very natural extroverted thinking extension. Remember, just because somebody's an introverted thinker doesn't mean they're not an extroverted thinker. Just because you're seeing a lot of extroverted thinking does not mean this function doesn't originate from introverted thinking. Emphasize the cognition more than the output. as much as you can, because if somebody's in the spotlight, you're only going to get part of the picture. You have thinking convergence, innovating upon in a highly introverted intuitive manner. Extroverted sensing components the type seamlessly takes in this stride and seamlessly improve upon as a natural extension of TI dominant systemization. Add in the highly natural extroverted thinking extension from dominant position, and you have a type grounded in concrete reality with a penchant for technological innovation. An ISTP can of course also mistype as an INFJ, but this tends to be from a more cognitive perspective. This person may realize the introverted thinking and introverted intuition within a psyche, but be more blind towards, well, their extroverted intuitive blind spot, and fail to notice their higher natural extension of introverted thinking into extroverted thinking, which is the blind spot of the INFJ. And on this occasion, an ISTP who thinks of an INFJ should look towards their extroverted feeling, because generally speaking, an extroverted feeling oppositional, especially in the ISTP owing to the intensity of this particular function, assigned as it is to extroverted sensing, tends to operate in short bursts. Prolonged bouts of extroverted feeling convergence can be incredibly draining for the ISTP. The type may explode with extroverted feeling charisma and proceed to shut down half an hour later. The extroverted feeling oppositional tends to be more easily drained by socializing, and prolonged bouts of convergent activity can be a struggle. They would tend to also struggle more with interpersonal conflict and mediation and exhibit greater social bipolarity than the INFJ. Now the ISFP. Generally, the more this person knows their cognitive functions, the less likely they are to mistype as INFJ. However, the ISFP can still mistake the attached logic of their FI-TI dip for the detached logic of the INFJ's NI-TI, particularly when you consider their natural, principle-based, often metaphorically charged lines of reasoning. But for all of the INFJ's introverted thinking organicity, if you will, the type is much more naturally detached than the ISFP, who by comparison would tend to have much more emotionally charged arguments, and may even tend to exhibit this very emotion in the midst of any such line of reasoning. And the only instances where the more attached logical style of the ISFP may be apparent is in cases of certain neurodivergences, such as maybe ASD. Generally, the TI and NI of the ISFP oozes an internal relational process, whereas the INFJ can come across as much more studious and erudite in their TI temperament. I mean, just look at me right now. And the ISFP may even downplay their intuitive feeling altogether, owing to its less intensive and more disparate NI nature. To this type, introverted feeling can feel colder, cooler. I mean, if you imagine an introverted feeling spread out across a larger surface area, it is less intense, absent an everything at once kind of FI-NI kaleidoscope, which this type can very much experience. There's a greater neutrality here. If you spread feeling over a greater surface area, it can feel, for all intents and purposes, cooler, colder even. And ISFPs may even identify more with INTJ, INTP reported periods of coldness than they would with the constantly limbically switched on introverted feeling descriptions pertaining more, let's be honest, to that of the ENFP and INFP. Typical introverted feeling descriptions tend to describe a concretized, introverted sensing informed introverted feeling, much more than they do an NI informed introverted feeling, which remains a highly misunderstood function. So it's no wonder an ISFP won't necessarily see this function in themselves. Here it is important to look to the dynamism and undulation of feeling as a whole within this type, as well as the consistency of their metamorphoses and transformations. The INFJ, by contrast, has an FI that is far more divergent than that of the actual FI dominant, whereas the ISFP finds himself in a constant state of limbic adaptation. The INFJ experiences introverted feeling as a far more mysterious and elusive force, exerting considerable unyielding influence upon the ego. Plus, FI and I tends to be a lot more explosive and downright kaleidoscopic than the divergent, relatively subconscious SI-FI pairing of the INFJ. Factor this in alongside a slight tendency for FI-NI to mold itself upon archetypes and sometimes even fictional characters, and you should have a decent way of distinguishing between the ISFP and INFJ. But I must mention, not every single ISFP under the sun is going to be moulding themselves on video game characters. Now, the ISFP and INTJ, on the other hand, is a completely different story. While the general differentiations between an NI dominant and an NI auxiliary are extremely useful here, there are additional factors that are useful to consider when you're seeking to tell the difference between each of these types. Firstly, let us explore the difference between extroverted thinking in authority and oppositional position. While certainly not every INTJ is going to be the hyper-pragmatic machine they are often portrayed to be, there is a certain intuitive practicality and common sense that comes with extroverted thinking in this position. The ISFP, by contrast with their NISC auxiliary axis, tends more towards idealistic dreams of grandeur that, for all the tangible internal quality, may not be as practically realizable as a type would like to think they are. But this can, on the flip side, result in a highly idealistic person with ambition worthy of legend. And fair enough, some of these NISE auxiliary types really do end up attaining their lofty goals. But considering this alongside extroverted thinking in oppositional position, there is a potential, at the very least, for practicality to fall by the wayside. So I guess in this situation you have more of a all-or-nothing approach to life. The INTJ, by contrast, with its extroverted thinking in authority position, tends to be a lot more logically cautious and more naturally content, inching closer, step by step, to a distant vision in a grand design on an everyday basis. And you could argue this instills a greater sense of habitualism, at least as it concerns consistent workflow. And this is quite the contrast to the more naturally explosive NISE auxiliary axis. And both the ISFP and the ISTP tend not to use introverted intuition for its own sake. After all, this function performs an auxiliary role, an assistive role, to the dominant function, which is by its nature a codec function, a rational function. Introverted intuition will be employed insofar as it serves internal rational agenda, rather than for its own more experiential sake. And on the note of introverted intuition being a more volitional function within each of these types, it's important to mention that INTJ can sometimes bypass introverted feeling in order to enter a colder, more logically detached state, in order to effectively take a break from the intensity of emotional rumination and reflection, just as the INFJ can enter prolonged periods of non-thought, bordering on zombification. And finally, in this module, it is important to note the volitional nature of the introverted intuitive auxiliary of the ISFP and ISTP, which, by contrast to the INTJ and INFJ, tends to be used in far more short and intense bursts of activity. Rather than the all-encapsulating modus operandi of the NI dominant, introverted intuition within these two types tends to A, not always be entirely switched on, and B, can actually cause these types to tire out in a way that would oftentimes be more noticeable by a third party. Okay, and with all of that out of the way, let us now conclude the video with an ISFP-ISTP comparison. And if you haven't already done so, I do recommend checking out my INTP-INFP comparisons, because once again we are dealing with FI versus TI dominance. Now here's where things might get just a little bit controversial. I, alongside CPT as a system, completely and utterly reject the idea of introverted feeling dominance having an absence of introverted thinking. Introverted thinking for these types being some kind of scrawny little function that barely ever sees the light of day. And same for TI dominance too. INTPs and ISTPs, the idea that these types are not deep feelers. The idea that they are some kind of cybernetic organism walking around in advance of the singularity. In reality, this whole cognitive function hierarchy thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, with 8 being automatically, owing to the descending order of this apparent list of preferences, being weak. This entire idea is nonsense and flies in the face of what is repeatedly shown time and time again to be the actuality. And the reality is as follows. The introverted feeling dominant has an extraordinary capacity for objective internal frameworking, just as the INTP has an extraordinary capacity for being deeply in touch with self-concept and meaningful value. And both of these types have excellent capacity for both relation and theory. It's just not always the case. Sometimes you will find an ISFP who struggles to substantiate their opinions and claims in the midst of a conversational setting. And sometimes you'll find an ISTP so deeply out of touch with their own introverted feeling values as to have sporadic eruptions of anger and even breakdowns out of the sight of other people. But generally speaking, each of these types possess ample dominant dips. The ISFP dips down into introverted thinking from an introverted feeling gateway, and the ISTP dips down into introverted feeling from an introverted thinking gateway. And it is these gateways, these origin points of the dip, that differentiates one type from another, much more than what function a type does or does not have. When ISFPs engage introverted thinking from dominant position, they are doing so in an attached logical style. If you think attached logic, think overarching principles behind reality, existentialism, philosophy, aspects of psychology, even astronomy. Attached logic tends to be of a less mechanistic nature and more focused upon the general energies of life. The detached introverted thinking of the ISTP, on the other hand, in this expansive dominant position, can encapsulate all of these topics and more, including more mechanistic, hard scientific pursuits like engineering and technological innovation. But detached logic pursues such things less as a form of limbic self-actualization and more as an extension towards competency or general curiosity. But here's where things get a little messier. Not every ISFP and ISTP is going to have a fully activated introverted intuitive auxiliary function, and in these cases, the types may dwell in a more introverted sensing-centric derived state, often relatively subjugated to the extroverted sensing authority. And in these instances, these types are going to dwell within a more introverted sensing-centric dormant state. These instances do usually coincide with a weaker dominant dip, for example, Fi into Ti, Ti into Fi. But the difference between Ti and Fi dominance here still holds true, which is as follows. Dominant Fi is convergent and therefore more consistently adaptive. The ISFP finds themselves in a constant state of limbic reassessment, with the emphasis upon the gradual expansion and realization of self. Rendering values static is actually rather counterintuitive here. The ISFP finds themselves in a constant state of limbic reassessment, and unlike Fi stereotypes, the hallmark of an Fi dominant is oftentimes not knowing who you are, knowing much more, for example, who you are aspiring to be. And you can see why ENTPs and ISFPs so consistently mistype as INFJ when you have other people in the community claiming that INFJs have this kind of I am who you need me to be mentality, when that is much more of a convergent feeling mindset in the first place. And the ISFP has a particularly amorphous introverted feeling owing to the introverted feeling, introverted intuitive dominant pairing. And this applies to even the most Ni unactivated variants of this type. And extroverted feeling itself is affected by this. An ISFP may, in the moment even, find themselves actively molding and adapting their identity in order to more authentically express whatever the situation requires them to be. And this is opposed to the ENTP, who, while similar, adapts on a much more extroverted feeling basis. The ENTP's fluid extroverted feeling is more like playing with a sounding board. If you press that button, the person will do this, so you better press that button instead. And this is usually from an altruistic agenda, I might add. And ISFPs can even engage such spontaneous self-transformation, this innate acting ability, to have fun with or even mess with people they know. And thinking, by contrast, is divergent here. An ISFP, especially considered alongside the extroverted nature of this thinking function, tends to be more consumption-oriented than the ISTP, and can spend hours on end delving into whatever current obsession they happen to have at the time. And the hyper-nuanced extroverted thinking, extroverted sensing, oppositional pairing of this type does actually make for a highly perfectionistic individual who would rather sit on a project for prolonged amounts of time until they absolutely know for certain that it is exactly as they want it to be. And as a result of this pairing's divergence, this type oftentimes has an exquisite taste for aesthetic nuance. And by contrast, the ISTP is far more chaotic and gung-ho with their logic. And as apt as they are at consuming information, they would much rather spend their time making new TI-NI associations and innovations within their mind. And oftentimes these TI-NI frameworks are more mechanistically oriented. Even introverted, intuitive, inactive ISTPs still tend to think more generally than they do specifically. And the type is more prone than the ISFP to make grand leaps of logic in their eagerness and sometimes even impatience for meaningful new discovery and peaks of mastery. And as a result, the ISTP does tend to be less perfectionistic than ISFP. But the perfectionism this type does have tends to stem more from an extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing center. Indeed, ISTPs are often hypersensitive to how they are viewed by other people, quite the converse to some ISFPs, who through a series of introverted feeling acrobatics display a remarkable tendency to wear shame and rejection as a kind of cloak or badge of honor, a marker of individuality. Generally, the ISTP, for all of their logical enthusiasm, tends to be perfectionistic insofar as the immediate reputation of the moment is concerned, or their competency in the eyes of other people. And as a rather simplistic heuristic, even as far as heuristics go, one could say that ISFP has a greater tendency to want to be loved, and ISTP has a greater tendency to want to be respected. Don't quote me on that. So that concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. You are awesome. And if you know anyone who you think might benefit from the contents of this video, be sure to share it with them as well. If you are uncertain about your type or just like to know about how your type applies more specifically to you as an individual, I do recommend checking out the CBT type service. And if you are interested in building upon your type or using your type towards the acquisition of certain goals and achievements, I do offer type coaching as well. And finally, CPT is also on Patreon, so if you are interested in supporting the channel and a theory on that additional level, it would be absolutely amazing to see you there. I do a live stream over there every single month, so if you are starving for more CPT content, it might be worth your time checking the page out. But of course, it goes without saying, I really massively appreciate your support over here as well. So that is it for me, and I'll be back in a week or so. For now, take care.